get together to learn Torah together, especially in the preparations for Yomim Noraim in this very, very strange year, a year in which here we are 10 days before Rosh Hashanah, and no one's quite sure. Will the shul be open? Will the shul be closed? Will we davening outside, davening inside? Do I have a seat? Do I not have a seat? How am I going to hear the shofar? Everything is still really up in the air. And but Be'ez Hashem, we will find a way to commemorate Rosh Hashanah and please God, get out of Rosh Hashanah the hitramamut, the inspiration which Rosh Hashanah has potentially to give us. Just to remind you, last week we focused on Hayom Haras Olam. Hayom Harat Olam. We focused on the idea that Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of the creation of man and woman. I mentioned that this is an idea which has got an enormous depth to it, and the connection to Rosh Hashanah we're going to look at a little bit more this morning before we go further. I also, we spoke about the idea of Zachrenu L'Tova B'Yom HaZikaron Hazeh, the idea of a Yom HaZikaron. We want HaKadosh Baruch Hu to remember us in our best light. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ato Zoche Masa Odom, Ein Davo Nelo Mimeka. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, has total recall. And we don't need in our tefillos to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to remember. That is a fact of our life. And if you remember, I gave you the modern moshel of that, of all our information stored in the cloud. It's all there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu remembers it all. What we're davening for is Zachrenu L'Tova. Zachrenu L'Tova, that we should be remembered in our best light. Everybody has done great things and does things they're not so proud of. We want to be remembered for the things that we did well, and the things that we didn't do so well, that happened for extenuating circumstances, and we ask for mechila. So that is the idea really behind Zachrenu L'Tova, very simply put, of course tremendously oversimplified. What I didn't really maybe emphasize enough, I'd like to have a look at a bit more closely, is the connection between two ideas. One idea that we looked at a few weeks ago is the idea of the Yom Hadin, right? Well, the Mishnah tells us, Kol boy olam over in the form of Kibnei Morom, that mankind is judged on Rosh Hashanah, and the connection between that and the fact that man was created on Rosh Hashanah. So those are two ideas that we both mentioned, but I haven't really looked closely enough really at the link between these two ideas, because there's a causal link between these two ideas. And we're going to look at that now today in the Medrash, and we're going to take the idea of Hayom Haras Olam one level deeper. And the reason why I'm looking at these ideas in depth is because these ideas give us a better grasp of our tefillah. When we're standing with our HaKadosh Baruch Hu in tefillah, what exactly are we asking for? And what is the mode of Rosh Hashanah? What is the whole, how do we find Chazal framing Rosh Hashanah for us and giving us a better idea of it? So I'd like to share with you a text, if this works. Here we go. Can you see a text? Henry, you see a text? Excellent, thank you very much. Okay. So we're going to be looking a bit more, focusing on the concept of tshuva itself, but let's first just follow this idea, because I think there's a very beautiful idea here. So in Bereshit chapter 2, famously, it speaks about Vayitzer Hashem Elokim es ha'adam ofar min ha'adama, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man out of the dust of the earth. There's a lot to be said about this, incidentally. The Chazal focus on this word Vayitzer, which is written with two yuds, because it could have been written with one yud, Vayitzer, HaKadosh Baruch from the word from the word to create, right? Yotzer or Vari Choshech, right? Yitzira. So it could have simply been Vayitzer with one yud. So Chazal are very interested in the two yuds, because the two yuds represent for Chazal the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara. And that's why we speak about the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, because of this one word in Bereshit chapter 2, Pasuk 7, that in the creation of man from the very, very first second, he was created by Yitzer with these two Yuds. What's it mean, the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara? That a man has got two different sources of motivation. One motivation which is more altruistic and caring and selfless and spiritual and generous and connected to his spiritual growth. That's the Yetzer HaTov. And one, the Yetzer Hara, which is more centered around the ego and the negative qualities of a person, of anger and jealousy, etc. So the Yetzer Hara, so by Yitzer, from the very beginning, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the man. So he's created Ofer min ha'adama, from the dust of the earth. And I mentioned to you, I think, last week, briefly, although it's a subject for a whole different shir, that of course we're all familiar with the scientific, secular story of evolution, and that evolution of the species and how different species evolved from earlier species, etc. And I said that in actual fact, the Torah doesn't have a problem with 90% of the whole evolution story. The only problem that we have in terms of the evolution story is to claim that the human being evolved out of the animal kingdom, because that is clearly a denial of the spiritual status of the human being. The human being was created. So here we have a pasuk saying explicitly that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took Ofer min ha'adama, he took the dust of the earth, and he created the physical human form. It wasn't from a previously existing primate of some sort. And then what did he do? Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, right? Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God creates man by creating first the physical body from the dust of the earth, from the elements, from all the elements from the physical world, and then vayipach ba'apav nishmas chayim, and then he breathes, right? He breathed into his nostrils nishmat chayim, and this is where we get the word neshama from. Now, this pasuk is a very important pasuk in terms of our language. We speak about the spiritual dimension of the human being as the neshama, right? The neshama is a soul. But actually, the word neshama comes from the word neshima, which means a breath, right? Nishmas chayim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu transmitted the neshama into the human being through a breath of some sort. Exactly what that means is difficult to understand. A lot of Kabbalistic material on this, which I'm not going into for the moment. But I call upon him, this pasuk emphasizes the hybrid nature of a human being as unique from all of the animal kingdom. The whole of the animal kingdom simply came to exist out of the creation of the animals in one way or another. And if you like to think of it as evolution, you're welcome to do so. But the human being did not evolve from any previous primate. The human being is a unique creation which combines the ruchnius with the gashmius, which combines the spiritual power of the neshama together with the physical reality of the body, the biology of the body. And the result was, Vayihi ha'adam the nefesh chaya, that the human being became a living being, a unique living being, completely different from all the other animal kingdom. But there is here a very interesting, I'm going to come back in a minute to the whole idea of the nishmas chayim, the breathing into the nostrils of the neshama. And I mentioned to you last week that actually this happens on Rosh Hashanah. The reason why we're learning about this is because Rosh Hashanah is the day, if you like, where this particular event is being commemorated, and maybe even more than that. Maybe it's even being replayed in a certain sense. That in a certain sense, every Rosh Hashanah, mankind is recreated. That this creation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by breathing the neshama into the physical body, that happens again and again every year on Rosh Hashanah. And that is really part of the meaning of Rosh Hashanah. But now I'd like to have a look at the Medrash, right? So I just picked out a few lines out of the Medrash, and I see I haven't translated it yet. But what the Medrash does, it goes through the 24 hours of that Yom HaShishi. We're looking at the very, very first Yom HaShishi because that Yom HaShishi is the model for Rosh Hashanah. In other words, every Rosh Hashanah is a replay of the original Yom HaShishi, the sixth day of the creation, where man emerged as this unique hybrid creature of a physical body containing a spiritual neshama. So the Medrash says as follows: B'Shvi'itz, Shvi'itz means the seventh hour of the day, right? It's actually talking about the seventh hour of the 12 hours of the day. It's not talking about the nighttime. It's not talking about a 24-hour system. It's talking about of the 12 hours of the day. So B'Shvi'itz was the first hour after midday, the seventh hour of the day. Zorak Bel Neshama. That's when the neshama was, so to speak, zarakbo, was inserted into the human being. B'Shminis, on the 8th hour, Hichnisu leGan Eden. He took him into Gan Eden, right, together with Chava. But Shias, what happened in the 9th hour, say Chazal, Chota. He got into Gan Eden. Within an hour, he already made a mistake. He already did the sin of eating from the tree that he was told not to eat from, whatever that means. Again, that is already a whole different parsha. Maybe one day we'll have some shiurim, how Chazal and Gedolei Yisrael understood what that Aveira was. But there's undoubtedly, that was the first human Aveira. And from one point of view, right, when we read that story, we think, gosh, this is a terrible disaster. This is the worst possible thing that could happen. Man is created, and on the first day of his life, he does an Aveira. What Chazal do very, very interestingly is, in order to understand Rosh Hashanah a bit better, they look at the Chet of Adam HaRishon, and they see it in a certain sense in a positive light. How so? Look at this. So what happens is that B'Shias Ichata Ubo Bayom. I'm not quite sure exactly. Okay, I've unmuted myself. Okay, Ubo Bayom Nidon, and on that day he is judged. Right. So here we have already a very interesting, deeper link between the Yom Hadin of Rosh Hashanah. Why is the Rosh Hashanah the Yom Hadin? Because it was the first act of din. In other words, the animal kingdom, the dinosaurs and the elephants and the whales were never judged by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why were they not judged? They didn't have any free choice. If they have no free will, they have no free choice, they have no spiritual dimension, so judging is irrelevant. Adam HaRishon, on the very first day, experienced something unique. He experienced that after he did the Chet, Ubo Bayom Nidon, and on that first day, he was judged. And what happened to him? Look at the interesting language of the Mishnah. V'yatsa b'dimus. And he came out of the court case, so to speak. He came out of the judgment, b'dimus, which means kaloma shezocha b'din. In other words, the judgment that he got was a compassionate judgment. Right? He received a judgment, and indeed, as we all know, he was thrown out of Gan Eden. But the judgment wasn't a destructive judgment. On the contrary, the judgment was an instructive judgment. In other words, he was put in a situation of bezeh sapecha tocha lechem, and that was meant to be a way that he can be mataken himself, that he can remedy himself in a different way. In other words, it was clear that he couldn't anymore live in the pure spiritual environment of Gan Eden. So he was out of Gan Eden, but he was still alive. He was forgiven in the sense that he continued to get life. Says the Medrash as well. So now what the Medrash does is spells out the causal link. I want you to understand there's a connection between this story and our Rosh Hashanah. How so? Says Omar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is the Midrashic interpretation. Omar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu ze siman levonecha. What has just now happened on the first Yom HaShishi, the first human being to do an Aveira and be judged and get a compassionate judgment, should be a siman levonecha. This will be a precedent for all of your descendants. And as I mentioned to you the very first year, that one of the unique features of Rosh Hashanah is that it's not focusing only on Am Yisrael. Right? Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot, and Yom Kippur are uniquely focusing on Am Yisrael. They connect to the unique status of the Jewish people. Rosh Hashanah relates to mankind, and now we're finding out why does it relate to mankind? Because it derives from Adam and Chava. All the descendants of Adam and Chava participate in the uniqueness of Rosh Hashanah. And if you understand this story properly, you understand that, of course, everybody in the world are B'nai Adam, are descendants of Adam and Chava. And so in this Medrash, siman levonecha. What's happened to you just now should be a siman, a precedent for your descendants. Kashem, just like she'omadata lefonai b'yom zeh, you stood before me today in judgment after you had committed a sin. V'yotzasa b'dimus, and you got a compassionate judgment. Kach, similarly, asidim bonecha, in the future, your descendants, Leah's omdim lefonai b'din zeh, they will also stand before me in judgment on this day, the yotzin b'dimus, and they will also get a compassionate judgment. So this is really, I think it's a very beautiful idea in Chazal, right? The Hayom Haras Olam means not just that this happens to be the anniversary of the creation of man, but it's the anniversary of creation of man. It's the anniversary of the first compassionate judgment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to mankind, and therefore we are, in a sense, commemorating that and davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we want to be, if you like, we want to be similarly judged. We want to be judged not in a midas hadin, but in a combined rachamim and din, like I spoke about last week. But I think this medrash is totally brilliant, a brilliant medrash, which gives us the most amazing connection between the anniversary of the creation of man and Rosh Hashanah. And now I just want to add one last idea, which I saw in the writings of Rav Yitzchak Hutner, Zichron Levracha. Some of you might have heard of Yitzchak Hutner, who's one of the great thinkers and Rosh Yeshivas of the previous generation in America. It was the Rosh Yeshiva, I think, of Chaim Berlin Yeshiva, I'm not mistaken, in New York. But he came to Yerushalayim in the last years of his life, and I still had the privilege to hear him firsthand, directly, when I was in the Mir Yeshiva in the 1970s. 1970s sounds like sort of ancient history. If you say 1970s to some of the young people today, they think there's like horses and carts in the streets. But when I was in yeshiva, in the Mir Yeshiva, I was in the Mir Yeshiva for several years in the 1970s. So Rav Yitzchak Hutner was giving shiurim, was giving some of his talks, and I had the zechus to hear him. But anyhow, he has published a whole range of svarim called Pachad Yitzchak. And in one of them, I'm just picking out one tiny little detail that he says that he makes a very beautiful connection, which is, if you like, adds to this idea that I'm just sharing with you this morning. And that is, he says, if it's true, if we follow this line of thought, that the spiritual dimension of the human being is the neshama, and the neshama was given to us by Yipach Ba'apov Nishmas Chayim, he says, breathing into us the breath of God, right? So he says that's why on Rosh Hashanah is the only time of the year that we have a mitzvah to perform, which is only done through our breath, which is the shofar. The shofar is the mitzvah of the breath of the human being to replicate, he says, the first breath of Adam and Chava, when they took their first breath was the breath of being endowed with a neshama. We have a mitzvah of a neshima, right? And if you look at the halachas of blowing the shofar, it speaks about this neshima and that neshima and having a long neshima, neshima achas, shtei neshimos, how exactly the Baal Takea is supposed to breathe while he's blowing the shofar. This is, he says, all part of this connection that we've just learned this morning. The connection between Rosh Hashanah and the first breath that was taken by Adam and Chava. They took this first breath, became the unique human beings that they were. They did an Aveira, that's true, but they were compassionately judged. And that's when we blow the shofar, we are replicating that neshima. So you have here a very interesting connection between the creation of the human being, between the existence of the neshama, and the blowing of the shofar, which is done just simply through the use of breath, not through the use of speech, not through the use of any other physical activity, just breathing. And that breath is the breath of the formation of the spiritual, if you like, essence of the human being. That is Rabbi Yitzhak Hutner's addition, which I thought was very beautiful, and I wanted to share with you. Okay. Let's move on now a little bit from this idea of the creation of man, and let's have a bit of a closer look at tshuva. As I mentioned to you before, we looked at this before, right? In the masterpiece Tefilot of Unasane Tokef, that Tefillah, which we looked at 2 or 3 weeks ago, right, starts off really in the most terrifying way. Right, the judgment of God is a judgment of life and death, and for individuals, of Al Hamadinos, Boye Omer, and our nations, everything is being held in the balance, and everything is being judged by God. And one tends to think, gosh, there's no way that anything good can come of this. This is going to be a disastrous day. It's the Eimas Adin, and then the whole tefillah turns around and says, no, nothing is predetermined. Or teshuva, or tefillah, or tzedakah. Ma'avirin as roa hagzeh. That there are ways in which we can remove any negative judgment, and of course it's tefillah, which is davening, and of course it's tzedakah, which is chesed and generosity and helping others. But the key, of course, is tshuva. The key is tshuva, and what does tshuva mean for us? And how are we going to look at it? So I'd like to look at that a little bit today, and I'll look at it again next week. Tshuva is a very, very fascinating subject. What is contained inside the word tshuva? Now, of course, if we've been talking about Adam and Chava, it's important to mention already from the very beginning that literally, what does the word teshuva mean? Teshuva means to return. In other words, in its essence, in this context, of course, when we speak about tshuva in context, we mean repentance. But actually, in essence, the original idea is to return to an original state. What teshuva means that we are able to turn the clock back. Or in the language of modern technology, since I gave you the moshel of my everything saved in the cloud, I can continue with the moshel from modern technology, about which incidentally I understand very little, but I do know bits and pieces of it. So tshuva is a return in the sense of a reset button. A reset button takes your whole computer back to how it was in the very beginning before you messed it up. Right? You messed it up by putting all sorts of stupid software on it and downloading all sorts of rubbish. And of course, the whole computer goes completely haywire. And then there's a reset button. And it's as good as new. You can bring it back to new. You lose some data along the way, but usually all you lose is rubbish. And what you do is you're able to return to how things were. In a sense, you're turning the clock back. Right? And tshuva means returning to an original state. And the original state from a spiritual point of view is a state of purity, a state of tahara, and a state of emunah. right? So we're returning, if you like, in so many different ways. And that's one of the beautiful ideas, which I'm going to look at now, that tshuva gives us this powerful idea of returning at several different levels. So let's have a look here. Now, interestingly, the origin of the mitzvah of tshuva is this week's parsha. Now, it's not a coincidence that the last Shabbos of every year is Nitzavim, or Nitzavim Vayelach. But the last parsha is Nitzavim because that's not a coincidence, because Nitzavim is the parsha of tshuva. Parshas Nitzavim, Devarim, chapter 30, is a chapter that everybody should know off by heart. It's a most, of all the parshas in the Torah, this is the most extraordinary parsha, particularly for people living in our generation. Because this is the one and only parsha which speaks about Kibbutz Golios, returning to Israel and the ingathering of the exiles. Generally speaking, all the psukim that speak about the messianic vision of the ingathering of all the exiles and the cancelling of the diaspora and bringing everybody back to Israel, all those psukim are in Yeshaya and in Zechariah and in other Nevi'im. But there is one place, and only one place, in the Chumash where this appears, and that is in this week's parsha, in Nitzavim, Devarim chapter 30. The whole of Nitzavim is only 40 psukim. Nitzavim is only really half a parsha. And indeed, Nitzavim Vayelach were considered really in many ways to be one parsha. Nitzavim Vayelach. It's really only the size of one parsha. And it's rare that we separate the two. And this year we're doing Nitzavim Vayelach, which is usually the case. But Parshas Nitzavim, Devarim chapter 30, comes after the end of last week's parsha, or Parshas Kisavo, which spoke about the horrific prediction of doom and destruction and suffering that Klal Yisrael go through in the Golus, and really a description. We are familiar with these descriptions through reading about inquisitions and holocausts and pogroms and all the other sufferings that Klal Yisrael have been through. And now, like a breath of fresh air after the darkness of the Teichacha in Kisavo, the Pasuk reads as follows. And this is the Parsha of Tshuva, and the word Tshuva appears in several different formats, almost in every Pasuk. Let's read a few Psukim together, and then we'll look at them a bit more closely. V'hayu ki yovoyu eilecha. Everybody with me? You can follow in the English if you like. V'hayu ki yovoyu eilecha kol hadvorim ha'eleh. Everything that I have predicted, says Moshe Rabbeinu, will take place. Habracha v'haklala, both the good times and the awful times. Asher nosati lefanecha, I present them all to you. What will happen then? So now he's predicting what's going to happen at the end of days. And then v'hashevosa el lavavecha. The word hashevosa is the word tshuva, right? It's the verb. Tshuva is the noun. V'hashevosa is the verb. V'hashevosa el lavavecha. You will reflect in your heart. In your heart, you'll go back. You'll return to how you should have been living and you should have been thinking. You'll return to your emunah. You'll return to your neshama. But where will you be? You will still be located. B'chol hagoyim. Asher yidichecha Hashem elokecha shama. You will still be in Galus, but while you're in Galus, there will be a wave of tshuva. So Moshe Rabbeinu is predicting a wave of tshuva coming through Klal Yisrael and a whole influx of people who've come to a new understanding of reconnecting to Judaism. Now, I must tell you, you and I have grown up in a generation where to speak about people being Baalei Tshuva is a normal part of our conversation. In the community, every community have got people who are Baalei Tshuva, who are distant from Judaism and found their way back again. And there are whole yeshivas and organizations, whether it's Eishat Torah or Sameach or Chabad, who really have got thousands of people who are Baalei Tshuva, Shlomo Carlebach, people who really went out into the world of people who were distant from Judaism, and thousands of people came back into Jewish life. Now, I want to tell you, in terms of Jewish history, this is nothing short of a total miraculous phenomenon. In terms of Jewish history, this was never, ever the case. There were always large numbers of people who defected from Jewish life, who abandoned Jewish life, and without exception, they assimilated and they were lost to the Jewish people. They never, ever found their way back again, with very, very few exceptions. You go back to the 19th century, the 18th century, there was one person who wanted to come back again, and this was an amazing thing. And the idea of a Baal Tshuva, in the sense that we use it nowadays. Now, I want to tell you, the way we use it nowadays isn't actually the correct way to use it. Being a Baal Tshuva is something that we should all be, being a Baal Tshuva, right? Right? This is a tshuva. Baal Tshuva means somebody who's engaging in the self-improvement of tshuva. So we are all Baalei Tshuva in the real sense of the word. In fact, there was a famous story about the late Gerer Rebbe, the previous Gerer Rebbe, where somebody came to him and they were discussing one thing or another. So the fellow says to the Rebbe, he says, "You know, I'm not a Baal Tshuva." So the Rebbe says to him, "Why not? Why not? Why aren't you a Baal Tshuva?" Everybody has to be a Baal Tshuva, but we use the term colloquially. We know how we use it. We use it to describe people who grew up in ignorance of Torah life and who found their way back again. This is nothing short of totally amazing phenomena. And I'm sure many of you, like me, I must tell you that I grew up in a Haredi environment and a more of a Haredi type family, and went to Haredi yeshivas. I only really met Baalei Tshuva much later on. And every time I heard the stories of Baalei Tshuva, how they found their way back, every time I found it very inspiring and amazing how people who were so distant from Klal Yisrael found their way back into Jewish life. But Moshe Rabbeinu is predicting this. He's saying there will come a time. And what I'm suggesting to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that Devarim chapter 30 is describing our century. It's describing our life where people stop, where the concept of V'hashevosa el levavecha, the concept of a wave of not just an individual doing tshuva, but a wave of tshuva coming through the Jewish people, that is something that will happen. And what will happen? V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, and you will return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we'll see in a minute the Ramban says that this pasuk v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha is one of the Taryag mitzvahs that applies to each and every one of us to engage in tshuva at some point in our lives, repeatedly in our lives, to engage in the self-improvement of tshuva, to return to be a better person, right? V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, you will return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'shamalta b'kolo, and you will listen to his voice. We'll see more about that as well. I'll go into that a bit more later on. What will happen? So Moshe Rabbeinu is promising that if you return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he will return to you. Right? In other words, it will be a reciprocal event. As you return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he will return to you, meaning he will accept your tshuva, right? He translated it, he will restore your fortunes. In other words, you've been in the diaspora, you've been dispossessed of the land of Israel. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu will v'shov v'kibetzcha mikol ha'amim. Here we get for the first time, mekabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bringing back together, is collecting, right? The kibetzecha mikol ha'amim, right? He's going to the kibbutz galuyot, right? From the nations, asher hefitzcha Hashem elokecha sham. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has scattered you to other nations, and he will gather you back, right? And here we had the word hidichacha, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu has pushed you aside, and you've been lost in the diaspora. And now HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'kibetzcha is the opposite idea to hidichacha. Hidichacha has pushed you aside. Kibetzcha is bringing you back together again. And this is the beginning of kibbutz golios. And here comes the famous pasuk, which we quote in our prayer for Medinas Yisrael. Im yeh nidacho b'tzei hashamayim, misham yikabetzcha Hashem elokecha misham yikachecha. Even if some of you are at the ends of the world, b'katzei hashamayim. So this katzei hashamayim can be taken either physically. In other words, it could be even if you're living in Honolulu or in New Zealand or in the Congo, or you're living in South America, or it doesn't matter where you're living. You could be living at the end of the world. From there, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring you back. Or it could be, B'Ktzei HaShamayim can be a spiritual description. We sometimes meet somebody who is completely, totally, sometimes says, well, he appears to be light years away from Jewish life. I'm sure you've all met people like that. I certainly have met people who are light years away from Jewish life. And they are B'Ktzei HaShamayim. I must share with you just a little anecdote. I must tell you that when I came to London in the 80s, so I was giving lunchtime shiurim in the city and in the West End. It was a dart program. I was giving shiurim in boardrooms by invitation only. I had hundreds of people who were really interested in these shiurim. Again, many of them were on their way back into Yiddishkeit after having spent a lifetime far away from it. But in order to have permission from these top law firms and consultancy firms and accountancy firms to use their boardroom once a week, I had to get permission from the partners. So I used to give the shiurim in the boardroom. And in most cases, one of the partners himself was a member of the Shia, and that's how it worked. And this went on for about 15 years. So it was very, very interesting time for me and for them. We learned a lot together, lots of discussions together. Anyhow, why do I mention all this? Because one day I've just finished giving the Shia, and I'm walking down the corridor in a very upmarket, expensive law firm in the city, and I'm being accompanied by one of the junior partners who is a member of the Shia. So we had about 25, 30 people in the Shia, and he's walking with me. And he says, oh, you see at the end of the corridor, that man standing there is the senior partner of the firm. And he was the person who insisted on giving permission to this group of the Shia to learn every week in your boardroom. I said, really? I mean, I'd met this guy before. He'd married out, and he was completely assimilated, and there was nothing Jewish about this person at all. And now I'm hearing that when the question came up at the board meeting, would we allow the boardroom to be used once a week for a Shia? This guy, the senior partner, he said, yes, definitely, I'd like it to happen. Okay, so I walked past it, so I introduced him. I never met him. I introduced myself, and I said, I just want to thank you for giving us permission to have a Shia, to learn once a week in your boardroom. He said to me, don't thank me, young man. At that time, I was still a young man, you understand? So, don't thank me, young man. He says, it's a mitzvah. So he said to me, it's a mitzvah. And I was like completely gobsmacked, I must be honest with you. And the fellow standing next to the junior partner who was walking with me was completely amazed that he even knew the word mitzvah. Not only did he know the word mitzvah, but somewhere deep in his mind, there was a concept of a mitzvah. A mitzvah was something which was required of him as being a member of the Jewish people. And here he had an opportunity to do a mitzvah, which was the use of his boardroom once a week for learning Torah. And I never forgot that. You know, it's something which sometimes you meet people and you think they are light years away from anything remotely Jewish. But if you drill down just a little bit below the surface, you can often find what Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about in Parshas Nitzavim, V'ashivosa el avavecha, that there is something there. There is a hook which you can. So I said to him, oh, well, if it's a mitzvah, why don't you come to the Shia? You know, I thought, well, you know, obviously if he's shown some interest, maybe I can get a new customer. So he says, no, I don't want to come to the Shia. Maybe he said next week after the Shia, I'll come in for have a fishbowl. And we used to serve, I don't know, little snacks or whatever. Anyhow, so fish balls he understood. That was part of his Jewish life. Fish balls was part of his Jewish life. Having a Shia, yes, the Pintele Yid. Sometimes, but having a shir was that was too much for him. But he knew about a mitzvah, and he wanted to do the mitzvah of hosting a shir in his city boardroom, which was all mahogany and air conditioning, and it was the fanciest boardroom you could ever see. And once a week we had the use of it for an hour and a quarter, and that was due to this man's idea that here was a mitzvah, an opportunity to do a mitzvah. So why do I mention all this? Because we're looking at this text. We're looking at this text where he says, "Bikatzei hashamayim." Some people appear to be at the end of the world. They're there in the sense that they are light years away from anything Jewish. But Moshe Rabbeinu says, even if they're at the end of the world, I will b'shami kabetzcha, I will gather them together b'shami kachecha, and what will I do with them? V'heviacha Hashem elakecha el ha'oretz asher yorshu avosecha v'yirishta, and He'll bring you back to the land of Israel, to the Eretz Avos, to the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, v'yirishta, and you will possess it, v'yitivcha v'hirbucha me'avosecha, and He'll make you more prosperous and more numerous than your fathers ever were. And this is the most remarkable prediction of Moshe Rabbeinu, having last week in Parashat Kisavo given us a prediction of doom, where Klal Yisrael will suffer the most unbelievable sufferings, really reminiscent of Holocaust stories. And then he says, and you know what will happen afterwards? Afterwards, there'll be a wave of tshuva. And here's the interesting thing, that the word tshuva, meaning to return, means a dual return, a return to the land and a return to God. That return takes place sort of at a dual level. It's not just a return to God, and it's not just a return to the land, it's a combined tshuva. The tshuva to Eretz Yisrael, and like was Shivat Zion. When we speak about Shivat Zion, the word Shiva, Shin Yud Beis, also comes to the word tshuva. It's all the same root. Lashuv. B'shuv Hashem as Shivas Zion Hayinu Kecholmim, right? The return to the land of Israel is Hayinu Kecholmim. It's a dream. It's a dream situation. And this is Ve'aviach Hashem Lekech Al Oretz Asher Yoshev V'Secha, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring us back to the land of Israel. And indeed, there's no question, right? No question that we have witnessed the beginnings of that, right? The Jews from the four corners of the globe, literally, being brought back to the land of Israel, coming back by their own initiative. Like most of the people listening to the shir today, including myself, coming back to the land of Israel, accompanied by a whole wave of people returning to Yiddishkeit, returning to Torah. That is predicted in Parshas Nitzavim. And then the pasuk goes on to say, "Umol Hashem elakeches levavcha, the next stage we haven't completely seen yet, which is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will open your heart, and you will view mitzvot, Torah and emunah and mitzvahs more positively. To love HaKadosh Baruch Hu with all the heart, v'ata toshu v'shamata, etc., etc. Right? And then he ends up by saying this very beautiful line. So he's speaking about the mitzvah of tshuva. And he says, if you tell somebody about the mitzvah of tshuva, he's likely to think, how can I change? It's impossible to change. I am who I am, and I've done what I've done, and that's who I am, and I'll always be like that. Says Moshe Rabbeinu, ki ha-mitzvah hazos. This is a phenomenal posibus. Ki ha-mitzvah hazos, this mitzvah of tshuva, asher onochi mitzavcha hayom, which I'm teaching you today, lo nifleisi mincha. It's not too niflesi from the word pele. Pele means something which is amazing, something which is incomprehensible, right? It's something which is, he translated here as too baffling for you. It's not too complicated for you. V'lo rechokahi, neither is it too distant. It's not rachok. Lo b'shamayim hi, another famous phrase of lo b'shamayim here means lots of different things, but in this context it means you don't have to go to heaven and engage in the highest spiritual endeavors in order to understand tshuva. How, and I'm skipping through this a bit quickly, it's not distant from you. Ki korov elecha hadava ma'od beficha ubevavcha lasas. It is the simplest thing. It's a very close to you, right? Beficha, and this is, so these three words are crucial words, which maybe we will revisit again when we learn the Rambam Hilchos Tshuva. But just to tell you that when the Torah gives us the mitzvah of tshuva, it says tshuva has to take place on three levels. Beficha, meaning there is some speech involved. Bilvavcha, meaning in your heart. And la'asoso, in practice. Beficha, bilvavcha, la'asoso is speech and the heart and in action. So the beficha is the vidui, is the necessity of saying vidui. We'll look at that, please God, next week. Ubilvavcha is in your heart, which is what Chazal call charota, to regret having done things that you're not proud of, things which you've done wrong. And la'asoso means to resolve in practice to improve, to do better next time. So beficha, b'vavcha, la'asoso is the short, if you like, formula of the whole mitzvah of tshuva. I brought you here, many of you will have heard of the book called the Tanya, right? The Tanya is a famous book written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, right? Can you see that? He wrote it about 220 years ago. And since it was written, it became really primarily, of course, the handbook of Chabad, but it has many admirers, including myself, who are not Chabad, right? Many admire it. It's the most amazing sefer. It's a really most profound and beautiful sefer in terms of understanding human nature, in terms of understanding spiritual growth, and understanding how spiritual life takes place. It's a very, very interesting book, and not an easy one at that. And this is the title page. So what does he say, the Baal HaTanya, on his title page? Let me tell you what this book is. So he says, so first of all, he says, melukat. So this is a bit of a statement of his modesty. He says it's basically a melukat, it's a likut. In fact, he calls the whole sefer a likutei amorim. Melukat means it's a collection. It's a collection of ideas that I've come across, and all I'm doing really is giving you an anthology, giving you really, I'm putting together different ideas. Of course, it's not true. It's part of his modesty. Really, a lot of it is his own very beautiful original thought. But he's telling you that he's basing it on Kadoshei Elyon, right? But look what he says. The whole book of the Tanya is a commentary on one pasuk. Look at this. Miyusad, he says. This whole book is based on one pasuk. What is the pasuk? Ki korov elecha hadava ma'od beficha ubevavcha la'aseh. That one pasuk from Devarim chapter 30, from Parshas Nitzavim, that it's very, very close to you, and it's accessible to everybody. Beficha ubevavcha la'aseh. That's what this sefer is about. This sefer is about what did Moshe Rabbeinu mean when he said those 8 words. What did he mean? In what sense is it close to you? In what sense is it easy to do? It's not really easy to do. It's quite an effort, and it needs a new frame of mind. But he says, my whole book is about how to get that new frame of mind and how to get closer to a fulfillment of this process. And I find that amazing. I find that quite amazing that a man like Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was one of the great genius and an amazing leader of Hasidus, right, in the early 1800s, that his magnum opus, right, this Tanya, that he says the whole book is simply a commentary on this one pasuk. That is really, I think, shows you how this single pasuk, if say Parshas Nitzavim, is a crucial pasuk to understand. There's a lot more I want to talk about today, but we're having a share next week. We're going to look at it again. But I want to share with you an idea, which is a very fascinating idea. Some of you will connect to it. Some of you maybe not so much, but I found it very fascinating, and I heard it from somebody who got it really from Kabbalistic and mystical sources. I'm myself not someone who spends time learning Kabbalah and Kabbalistic sources. But on the other hand, the principle in Kabbalah is that those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. That's the general principle in Kabbalah. People who go around saying, I'm a great Kabbalist, right, are usually people who've just been reading some secondary literature, and people who are genuine Kabbalists, it's part of Kabbalah to keep it secret. So those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. And but I'm not in any way a scholar of Kabbalah. But then again, you'll never know. Maybe I am. I'm just not telling you. But I'm not. I guarantee you that I'm not. I'm just what is true is I have several friends of mine, colleagues, who are much more into this field. So he told me something quite amazing, and I just want to share this with you, because I've said in this Shia that Parshas Nitzavim I've always felt particularly relevant to our generation because of the kibbutz golius and the wave of tshuva. Both of these phenomenon are unique to our generation. Never, to the best of my knowledge, in the history of Klal Yisrael, has there been such a kibbutz galiot, such an ingathering of the diaspora, and never has there been such a wave of balei tshuva. Neither of these two things have ever happened before, to the best of my knowledge, in Jewish history, and they've happened together in the last century. So I was told the following thing. The Gemara says, in Avodah Zarah, the Gemara says in the Zohar in a couple of places, that the world as we know it was designed to last for 6,000 years. Right? We're just coming up to the end of the year 5,780. Okay? So the year 5,780 years ago was the day on which Adam and Chava breathed their first breath, if you want to connect this to the beginning of our shit. So he says that the Chumash is divided up into parshias, right? And it's divided up in a way as follows, that the first two parshias, Bereishis and Noach, are connected, reflect the events of the first millennia of life, right? The Adam and Cain and Hevel and the beginning of the flood and everything. That was the first millennia, right? And then you have Lech Lecha really starts Jewish history. So he says in the Kabbalistic writings is written that the 6 millennia, the 6,000 years are reflected in the Chamishe Chumshei Torah, because the first 2 chapters are the first millennia, and then the next 10 chapters of Bereishis, Lech Lecha Vayerach Haisora told us Vayetze Vayishlach Vayeshev Miketz Vayigash Vayechi. Those 10 parshias, each of them represents 1 century in the second millennia. And indeed, in the second millennia was the second millennia of the Avos and Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the stories of Bereishis took place in the second millennia. Right? In the third millennia, that's already Sefer Shmos. Sefer Shmos is the third millennia, where we have Matan Torah and Yisro and the Mishkan. Right? All that is in the third millennia, and that's Vayikra. Vayikra is all the halachas. So one second. So that is the Shmos is the third millennia, and we have Matan Torah and the building of the Mishkan. The fourth millennia is Vayikra, right? And that is already the Beis HaMikdash and all the Karbonos, and that's what happened really in the fourth millennia, was the Binyan Beis HaMikdash and the bringing of the Karbonos in the Beis HaMikdash in Eretz Yisrael. The fifth millennia is Bamidbar. Bamidbar is the Golus. Vayisu Vayachnu, Vayisu Vayachnu. Klal Yisrael were moving around in the Golus in the fifth millennia. And the sixth millennia is what we're in at the moment. Okay? So he says, if you look at the sixth millennia, I'm cutting this a little bit short because we're last 2 minutes of the Shia, and I hope you'll follow this, even though I'm doing it a bit quickly. In the sixth millennia, right, we are currently in the 8th century of the sixth millennia, right? In the year 5,000, we're in the year 5,780, right? In the year 5,700, that's 80 years ago, in the year 1940 of our counting, began the 8th century of the 6th millennia. Are you following me? So if we follow all the parshias in Devarim, right? We follow the parshas in Devarim, and I told you before, Nitzavim Vayelach is one parsha. So you have Devarim, Veschanan, Ekev, Re'ei, Shoftim, Kiseitze, Kisavo, Nitzavim Vayelach, Hazinu, V'zos HaBracha. Okay? So it comes out that Nitzavim Vayelach is the 8th century of the 6th millennia, which started in the year 1940 and will end in the year 2040. And that is the century of Kibbutz Golios and the waves of Tshuva in Klal Yisrael. So within the way in which the Chumash is structured, right, you have a parsha for every century of the 6 millennia, and each one of them contains certain references to events that will happen in that time. Now it's interesting that the 7th century, which is Parshas Kisavoi, took us up to 1940, which was the beginning of the Holocaust. So the very, very end of Kisavoi is the Holocaust, and that is in the 7th century of the 6th millennia. Now we're in the 8th century of the 6th millennia, and I think it doesn't take great genius to join some of these dots and understand that in our century, right, we are living through events described in Nitzavim Vayelech, and in particular the tshuva, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe Rabbeinu guaranteed for us, and we're going to see, please God, next week in the Rambam. The Rambam says that there's a guarantee from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even though the human being is given bechira, and if we've got freedom of choice, it could be that things will simply go from bad to worse and from worse to even worse. But the Torah guarantees us that Basof HaGolus Yasu Tshuva. Now, Klal Yisrael will eventually return, and return is Tarete Mashma. Return is true at 2 levels. It's a return to Eretz Yisrael and a return to HaKadosh Baruch. And they come hand in hand, and that is really the beauty of Parshas Nitzavim, and that is really the best way to prepare your mind to go towards Rosh Hashanah. And please God, we will continue this next week at some point. Very nice to see you all. And please God, we will learn some more next week.
It's muted.
It's muted.
Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed this share. I tried to take you through some ideas from the Tzavim and some ideas from Adam and Chava, from the story of the creation. And all these are really the underlying principles of Rosh Hashanah and indeed the Aseret Yemei Tshuva.
Thank you. Thank you very
much. All. Nice to see you, Murray. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you
Thank
all.
you, Rabbi. Thank
and Avram, nice to see you as well. Nice to see
Brilliant.
Avram and Elian.
Brilliant.
And Henry, of course, Ellie and Adele, and Shlomo Fox, with lots of our regulars. And one day, please God, one day we will have a share face to face. Remember what that looks like?